Of course, I want to start by extending warm thanks to all the panelists for extremely interesting 2 days, and to the organizers for having us and for having me, for letting me, for including me in the program. And we had a small discussion yesterday at dinner on the word affiliation. And actually, since that was written, I'm now employed. So the discussion goes on. Which one is a good and bad thing? Anyways, I will present a case on a translation from one corner of the European scene, Scandinavia, and this is part of an ongoing interest in Scandinavian representations of the Qur'an, which ties in with both intellectual history, Qur'anic studies, and translation studies. So my questions will be like, what are the constituting elements of the Qur'an according to my guy, Christian Stolpe, and what is the Qur'an to him? In terms of function, why does he engage the Qur'an? What instrumental functions does it have for him or to him? So I said early modern period is probably late early modern period. Johann Fredrik Sebastian Crucian Stolpe, he was a Swede. But he lived most of his life outside of Sweden, although he translated the Qur'an into Swedish, so his interest was in Sweden, but he didn't live there very much of his life. So the question is, how then was he received in the audience that he wanted to connect to? So his family background was from higher civil servants and the higher strands of society, but he himself was some kind of, I think, a little bit of an enfant terrible in his young days. He had a short military career before joining the Greek war against the Ottomans, but then he came into consular services. So he spent most of his life on both sides of the Mediterranean, and first of all in Tripolis, where he was a commercial secretary, and where he probably caught the interest of the language, Arabic language, working with one man of letters and an Arabist called Jacob Gråberg. So there are so few details on the life of Christian Stolpe, so I think the few details that are there, I'm trying to wrestle with them to make some sense of his story. So he moved on to different parts, but the part that is really interesting to me is the years that he spent in Tangier, where he really worked on getting knowledge of the Arabic language. And why I'm emphasizing this point is that we will later see that he was not his Arabic was not acknowledged. So that is why this is important. And these are also the years where he worked on this translation. So Tangier, as most of you probably know, it was the center of the Moroccan diplomatic communications with the European powers at this point, and the Scandinavian countries had particular interest because of the treaties that had been there between the states for protection against the piracy in the Mediterranean. Norway, Sweden together, and Denmark, they were both having large debts. So there were negotiations to reduce those debts. And of course, the French invasion in 1830, it reduced the debts towards Algeria, but also the Moroccan case was on the table. So Christian Stolpe had a hand in these negotiations as an interpreter, first of all. But he was here vouched for by the British diplomat working on these negotiations. So the important point to me here is that he was a diplomat. He was not pretending to be or wanting probably to be an academic. He was a hands-on man working on the ground, but also had an interest. And when he started working on his translation of the Qur'an, he tied in with the academic discourses. So that is one context that he is in. And the other context he is working towards is, of course, the Swedish context. And this is Imperial Sweden at the end of the period of the Imperial Sweden, although they will still hold on to Norway for another 100 years. But I call this like a double periphery. So Sweden is peripheric to the Muslim world, and the Muslim world is peripheric to Sweden. Yet, of course, you have lots of scholars working on Hebrew and Arabic because of Hebrew mostly, not because of itself. And on the other hand, you have a public interest, very much so, that is into more or less mostly into the curiosa. You have a cultural elite that is interested. You find translations of the Qur'an in many of the book collections. So there is this academia on one hand that is still up to the very beginning of the 19th century is working only in Latin, also in Sweden, in the big universities. But at the beginning of the 19th century, they start to work in Swedish. And you have a few translations of little bits and pieces of the text into Swedish. But of course, the apparatus, the whole discourse around it is in Latin, and it's very much for the academic scene. So this is where Stolpe comes into the picture, because he is eager now to make something for the public, for the Swedish public. And finally, in 1843, he publishes his translation, self-financed. It was apparently finished already in 1840-41. The first announcements came in the newspapers, but lacked founding. So, and this says something about the interest as well, probably. It was published in a newly established publishing house that was actually working on calendars and some historical work and some academic work, mostly textbooks and useful information. And this is the only publication we have from Stolpe's hand. So it's the only source also to knowing much about, you know, his motivations and his strategies. There are a few letters that we will see, but mostly it's this publication in itself. So this talks to a few things. It talks to the centrality of the Quran. He wants to he's not particularly interested in the Quran, it seems, but he wants to convey something about the Muslim culture, about the Muslims that he has encountered in his sojourns abroad. And the centrality of the Quran makes him want to go to this particular source, I think, actually. He doesn't say that in so many words. The reception that he had, the initial reception that he had, is just a few notes, like commercial notes, sales announcements. And there is one review that I will return to because it was crushing. So other than that, the reception is meager. And it's a bit peculiar because there is so much in the newspapers, like more of this exotic curiosa kind of material. But when finally something is on the table, the interest seems to be not too much. But it's difficult to know. We don't have sales numbers from this period, for instance. We only can go by what is written about it in newspapers, and what is written about it in other works. You have one big personality, Agnes from Krusenstjerna, who names one of her protagonists in one of her novels after him, but that's about it. So his title is Qur'an, in the indefinite form. So we've been discussing the definite and the indefinite form, and probably I'll get a little bit back to that because he has something to say about it. Oi, we have to. Yeah. This front page also talks to the importance of the original text. He says that it is translated from the Arabic original. So it's a way to gain authority, to gain the trust of the public, probably. But he also makes a historical contextualization in his introduction. So this proper name, Qur'an, is in the indefinite form retained throughout the text. And even a word like kitab is also very often, not always, but very often translated book and sometimes glossed Qur'an. So he has lots to say about the Qur'an, especially in his introduction, but also in some of the commentaries and apparatus. And here we see that he speaks about the word Qur'an, which is the name of the so-called revelations of the prophet. And even here he has the indefinite form in the Arabic, Qur'an. And of course he already flags his attitude towards the text by saying so-called revelations, but we will see that it's ambiguous. It goes different in different directions. His attitude, but we see how he understands the text to be a reading and a scripture. So the oral and the written part is both part of his conceptualization, and it's a historical, communicative, dynamic event, the way he understands it. So the format is quite conventional. It has a short preface, quite long introduction which speaks to the historical situation and the character and biography of the prophet. He uses Flügel's edition. There are no parallel texts of any kind, but he, as we have already seen, in between he writes the words that he wants to gloss in the Arabic script. And there are ample footnotes, translation choices, explanations, clarifications, and occasionally also further comments. So by all this, he is working himself into an academic discourse without saying it in so many words himself. What he does say in so many words is that he wants to do this translation because he wants a meaningful thing to do in his leisure time. So that is the first thing he mentions, is the most important thing probably then, that he had leisure time and he wanted to use it for something interesting or useful, and he opted for translating the Qur'an, and something that is of benefit to the people after having met the other people. So after having met the other people, the Muslims, he realizes that there are so many false impressions going on in his first people, the Swedes. And the example that he mentions is the example of the hanging coffin, which is a fable about the coffin hanging in the air with magnets only to hold it. And this is a story, and I found it in your book, of course, and this is a story that goes around, and it also found its way into Swedish newspapers. And this is the point that he's precisely mentioning as a motivation for going into this. So it is not really clear how translating the Qur'an will rectify this particular fable, but it will give another story, of course. He doesn't mention this fable anywhere else, so the particularities of the fable is not very clear. But probably something like when the whole picture is put on the table, people will realize that even this story is really just a falsification. But he will also want to familiarize the Swedes with the lawmaker and his law. And there we see one of the elements that has been very familiar in many of the presentations that we have already seen, the concept of law. Of course, he uses many sources. Although working on the Arabic text, he uses mostly Marashi and Saleh, something of Sabari, but it's not very often that he acknowledges that, at least. But he acknowledges his sources throughout in the footnotes. So Marashi and Saleh are very prominent, and for the introduction on the Prophet, Saleh's preliminary discourse is very prominent. But most importantly, he has to add that he had the advantage of receiving confirmation of his interpretation from a Mohammedan student, lärjunge. So this is very important to him, and he has to impress this. And he talks about one Mohammedan student. So he has one informant. This person doesn't have a name, of course. His other sources have names. This one, he doesn't have a name, but he is very important. And I think this is also, he's trying to make, of course, extend some gratitude, and also make a case for his own authority, but without making it too bluntly or something like. I'm not sure what to make of it exactly, but he's anonymous at least. Maybe I'll just, because the point here was just the law, so I'll go directly to one of the examples of the translation, where the concept of law comes into the picture. So it comes into the picture several places, but it comes into the picture when he translates shari'a or sharia, where he uses the word law, lag, and also when translating Tawrat, he also uses the word lag, law. So here I have the English back translation actually, and for the upper not. Okay. So this ties very well into the notion of Judaism and Islam as religions of law, whereas Christianity is a religion of salvation. But he doesn't really flag his religious affiliation in so many words. He says about the core message of the Qur'an, he says that it is the oneness of God, and probably and this is really the core message and the most important message. And he says also that if this is understood the way that is really understood by the followers of the Qur'an, it will be an hindrance for any Christian attempt at conversion. So he, in a way, discusses Trinity in an indirect way with this, emphasizing the oneness of God as a core message of the Quran. But he doesn't give any signs that he's not a Christian, but he doesn't also give any signs that it is that or anything else. I don't know, it might be one of the practicalities of working as a diplomat. So in this connection, it's also interesting to look at how he translates the words pertaining to Islam, Aslama Muslim then. And this is why my question earlier comes into the picture, because looking at how these words are translated can tell us something about how the translator is perceiving the whatever it is, Deen, Islam. So he Crusenstolpe, he mixes. For instance, when we look at the word Muslim, he translates this with quote-unquote technical terms like Muslim when he speaks about Abraham. But in all other occurrences, he uses general semantic translations like subjected, submitted, and these kind of things. So that is a sort of what I call a negotiated solution between the universal understanding of the deen and the more particularistic understanding of the deen. So on the other hand, the word Islam is throughout translated with Islam as alone. But of course, in the Swedish, this is a technical term. We were talking about technical. What is a technical term earlier? In Swedish, Muslim and Islam is a technical term. Even in this time, although they would speak of Mohammedans more than Muslims. So this choosing the technical loan term over the semantic term says something about the understanding.
For
yes.
a minute.
Okay. One interesting point that element in his conceptualization is, of course, the linguistic quality of the text, and he speaks about this in connection to the challenge, to the tahaddi, where the Arabicness of the text is a fundamental element, but it is also something that produces the text in a way. So we see that the Qur'an demonstrates everywhere examples of the disposition of the people and this language. So the people and their language produces the text, as well as being a testament, as the text being a testament to these people, as we see in the larger segment. Because of the oral quality that will seduce the Arabic ear into believing before they even have the time to think about what the text means. So let me just use my couple of last minutes on the reception and on the critique. He had a fierce critic in Henrik Gerhard Lindgren, who was an academic himself and who criticizes on the grounds that Crusenstolpe did not know Arabic, that he uses Marathi and Saleh, and that he just patched together from these sources. And we see that one of the examples that he uses, that Lindgren uses, is that he says that Crusenstolpe's translation, this book is not equivocal, it is is guidance for the God-fearing. It's a wrong translation. Of course, Crusenstolpe only uses one of the possible readings here, and he copies in a way Marathi and Saleh, but he doesn't argue that he copies Marathi and Saleh. He argues that linguistically and by that this is supported by the interpretation of the believers. So this Lindgren, he criticizes Crusenstolpe maybe for his own benefits, because in this particular period he is trying to secure his own position as a full professor, because he has only been a temporary professor at the University of Uppsala, and now he's trying to secure his own and I mean, this is speculation, of course, he doesn't say this, but it's a way of asserting your academic credentials. Working on the Qur'an is a way of asserting academic credentials, and probably more in this period than some of the more other familiar periods. So Crusenstolpe writes to another academic, Carl Johannes Thornberg, and pleads with him to take to vote for him for the journal to print Crusenstolpe's answer to this critique. Thornberg doesn't answer him at all according to the archives of letters, and of course we don't know, but the article is not, the response to the review is not printed. So Thornberg is also in the business of securing his own position. Of course, Thornberg is a renowned academic. He will go on to being even more renowned. But in this particular period that we're talking about, he is a temporary professor at the university, and for the academians, it's important to grab this field for themselves. You can't let any Tom, Dick and Harry come in from Morocco and say they know anything about the Qur'an. So this speaks to also the instrumental function that working on the Qur'an has.
You have to finish.
I have to finish, so I will. Actually, I will just finish on that. So. All these discussions around what is and what isn't is part of the European Qur'an, of course. And it forms an accumulated archive. And in this sense, as we speak, we produce also the European Qur'an.
Thank you.